moving on, role of mammography in breast cancer. First of all, let us see some facts about breast cancer. 1 out of 22 women are diagnosed with breast cancer in India. And the most surprising fact is, every 6.5 minutes, a woman is diagnosed with breast cancer. And this risk of breast cancer is increasing with age. Most women who are diagnosed with breast cancer, they don't have the family history, so rather it is sporadic. And only 8 to 10% constitute familial breast cancer. A landmark study done by Indian Council of Medical Research demonstrated that the incidence of breast cancer nearly doubled in metropolitan cities. And India's National Health Policy 2010 predicted that by 2020, the breast cancer is going to overtake the cervical cancer in India. Let us see the age differences 25 years back and now. The current study is marked in red and the blue one represents the 25 years back. When we see 20 to 30 years age group, there were only 2 cases in the 25 years back and now 4 cases. And next 30 to 40 years it is 16, increased from 7 to 16. And from 40 to 60 years, from 22 it is increased to 28. So this graph shows that there is increasing breast cancer in the younger women. Though the ACR and National Cancer Institute recommend the breast cancer to the screenings to start at 40 years, this graph indicates that it's more common in younger women. It is not rare. And when we see the metropolitan cities, the blue one indicates in the Mumbai. It's just raising sharply. And the yellow one is in the Bangalore, even it's not less. Here also we see the raising trend. And this brown one is in the Chennai. So overall in the metropolitan cities, maybe which is related to the lifestyle changes, it's market increase in there. And breast cancer, as you know, is in the second position right now next to the cervical cancer. Just to briefly tell about the known risk factors. First of all, being a female is a risk factor. Increasing age, any previous history of breast cancer, any benign disease, proven benign disease which is now turned into a malignancy, not breastfed, use of hormone replacement therapies, and a family history of breast cancer, no children or few children, and having children at later stages after 30, early puberty and late menopause, obesity especially in the post-menopausal women, high consumption of alcohol. So just to overall the types of breast cancer include the intralobular, interlobular, lymphoma and metastasis. And among this breast cancer, adenocarcinoma accounts for the 99% of the breast cancer. Ductal carcinoma is the most common one. So, as we see in this slide, ductal carcinoma in situ, it represents 25 to 30% of all reported breast cancers. And approximately 95% of all ductal carcinoma in situ is diagnosed because of mammographically detected microcalcifications. This explains the role of mammography in breast cancer. Staging of breast cancer, T1 to T4. T1 is less than 2 centimeters or equal to. T2 is 2 to 5 centimeters. T3 is more than 5 centimeters. And T4 is involvement of the chest wall. In T4, there is A, B and C and D. A means chest wall involvement, B is skin involvement, and C is both involvement of the skin and chest wall, and D is an inflammatory carcinoma. And lymph nodes is N0 is no lymph node, N1 is upper lymph node involvement, N2A is the lymph nodes are matted, N2B is internal mammillary lymph nodes are there, N3A is infraclavicular, 3B is retrosternal lymph node, and N3C is supraclavicular. And metastasis wise, there may be metastasis or no metastasis. When it is metastasis, as we all know that it metastasis to the brain, lung, liver and bone. These are the common sites. So this is all the facts regarding the breast cancer. So let us see the mammography. You must have seen a poster depicting that RxDX as a digital mammography. What is so special about digital mammography when compared to screen film mammography? This digital mammography, it allows the radiologist to adjust, capture, adjust, store and retrieve the images digitally. So thereby you are able to access any time and you can share the images. That is when it promotes telemammography. And subtle differences between the normal and the abnormal tissues are attenuated. So you can easily mark out which is abnormal and which is normal. And fewer follow-up procedures are required and fewer repeat images. So thereby you are decreasing the radiation dose to the patient. And digital mammography is better for younger women and women with dense breasts. This was a study, there was a study called, done by the New England Journal of Medicine in 2005. It supports because younger women have more denser breasts. And to just outline the views of mammography.
When to do a sonomammogram?
Yeah, I'm going to come to that. I'll come to that. Just to outline the standard views, craniocaudal and mediolateral oblique views. BIRADS has set a report organization where it's telling that the report has to be in this order. It should carry an indication, it should carry breast composition, it should carry the findings, and if any comparison to the previous study, we have to tell whether any increase or decrease is there, overall assessment and management recommendations. This image is telling about the breast composition. The extreme left one is the completely fatty, next is the scattered glandular tissue, the third one is the heterogeneously dense breast, and the fourth one is the extremely dense breast. And these are the things which we are telling regarding type 3 and type 4. This BIRADS is a comprehensive guide where it is telling the standardized breast imaging terminology, report organization, assessment structure and classification, not just for mammography, for the breast ultrasound and MRI also. It's a collaborative effort with the National Cancer Institute, Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, FDA, American Medical Association, American College of Surgeons and the College of American Pathologists. Here both the pathologists and even surgeons are also involved. And final assessment category includes 0 to 6. 0 is it needs additional imaging evaluation, maybe in the form of prior mammogram to compare or an additional breast ultrasound. 1 is negative, there is nothing else to do, it's completely negative. 2 is benign findings, whatever we are documenting. 3 is probably benign finding where it accounts to less than 2% malignancy, and here short-term interval follow-up is suggested. Type 4 is suspicious abnormality, it carries 2 to 95% malignancy, and biopsy should be considered in 4. And ACR BIRADS 5 is highly suggestive of malignancy, there is more than 95% malignancy is there and appropriate action should be taken. And 6 is a known biopsy proven malignancy. At the end of a mammography report, the BIRADS has to be given from 0 to 6. In each division there are subdivisions, so accordingly it has to be mentioned. As we know, mammography there are two types, screening and diagnostic. Screening mammography is an examination which is performed on an asymptomatic to rule out chances of the breast cancer, and diagnostic is one who has come with some symptoms. So we are doing breast mammography to categorize what type of cancer and what is the stage, all those things. And to tell screening mammography involves usually the standard views, the craniocaudal and mediolateral oblique. But whereas for the diagnostic mammography, we may require additional views like a cone view or a spot compression view to further characterize the calcifications. And screening mammography is recommended by National Cancer Institute, 40 years or older, and the mammogram to be once in a year or once in 2 years. And this recommendation is varied from one recommendation to the other. And the motto of the screening mammogram is early detection of the breast cancer. But by screening, we are not reducing the woman's chance of dying from breast cancer. We are just trying to detect the cancer and treat it at an earlier stage. And the most negative part of it is false negative results are there. That is a normal mammo when there is a breast cancer, and this is seen in 20%. That is because of the high breast density when a supplementary procedure is not recommended. Only mammogram is done. And this is National Health Service by UK recommending the screening. So according to this, under 30 it's not recommended, 30 to 39 no, it's 40 to 49 not recommended, and 50 plus it is mammograms every 3 years they are recommended. But according to the ACR and according to the National Cancer Institute, the screening starts from 40 years, and every once in a year or once in 2 years is the recommendation which we are following right now. Coming to the genes which are causing the breast cancer, BRCA1 and 2. These are called breast cancer susceptibility genes 1 and 2. They are not abnormal per se. They are the normal tumor suppressor genes. But when some abnormal mutation occurs in them, yes, they are the strongest cause for breast cancer. There are other, not just BRCA1 and 2, there are other causes for this. And among this, TP53 is one more important, which is known to cause even breast and ovarian cancer. And these mutations are more common. This mutated BRCA gene 1 and 2 are more common in Jewish population. So it tells that these people are 5 times more prone for breast cancer. They have a 5 times higher chances of breast cancer when compared to the normal population. This increased tendency is also seen in Norwegian, Dutch and Iceland people. So let us come to the familial breast cancer. How common is this? It accounts only for the 8 to 10% of overall breast cancer, and remaining 90% are sporadic. And this breast cancer genes we have already seen, so the 3 important to be remembered: BRCA1, BRCA2 and TP53. So when a person, one of the members in the family has a mutated gene, how they are going to transmit? So 50% of the children are going to get. This table clearly tells it not just mother or father in a family, 50% chance is transmitting. Sister or a brother, 50% chance. Identical twin, all are non-phenomenal, 100% or 0%. Aunt, uncle or a grandparent, 25% of chances. And great aunt or cousin, there is 12.5%. Let us come to the strong family history and moderate family history. These two are important because in these situations, we have to tell the patient you have to undergo a genetic screening. So strong family history is seen when there is 2 first-degree relatives or 2 second-degree relatives have breast cancer less than 50 years. When they had breast cancer, the age should be less than 50 years. Either 2 first degree or 2 second degree. Or another is 3 first degree or 2 second degree less than 60 years. Or any 4 relatives at any age. So these are the 3 things which these 3 categories fall into a strong family history. So we should refer to a specialist genetic clinic where they'll do further investigation. Moderate family history of only 1 first degree relative less than 40 years they have got breast cancer, or 2 first degree relatives or 1 first degree relative and a 1 second degree relative less than 50 years. It's really important. It sounds so odd, what is this first degree, second degree, but it's very important because when a patient comes and asks you, should I undergo this genetic test? Yes, we have to follow this, and if they fit into either a moderately risk group or a high risk group, we have to recommend the genetic test. What do these results tell? If a person comes with a negative or inconclusive, what does it mean? Inconclusive or negative means that particular mutation which was there in the family is not there in this person. But the chances of breast cancer due to unknown mutation is not excluded. So the genetist will not be able to tell how much this person is going to transfer to their children. If it is positive, yes, that gene is transferred, and as I already told that in this table, it's depicting the person who involved decides how much percentage will be transferred. So they already know that they have and how much they are at risk and how much they are going to transfer to the children. If it is completely negative, yes, that particular mutation was not there, but we don't know some other mutation, and we cannot assess further how much they are going to transfer. Once a patient comes with a positive genetic test, so what's next? A prophylactic mastectomy. As we all know, Angelina Jolie, she underwent prophylactic mastectomy. This is one of the first procedures. Second one is chemo prevention, that is tamoxifen or raloxifene. These both are FDA approved. That is use of natural or synthetic substances to reduce the risk of developing cancer or to reduce the chance that the cancer will come back. Either of the situations. Age, how it's going to affect the breast cancer. Incidence sharply increases with increasing age. 80% seen in postmenopausal women, and it was extremely rare in younger women. Now the incidence is changing. Odds ratio for high breast density. We always write, when we get a mammogram, we write it is Barrett's 3 or Barrett's 4, needs additional evaluation with breast ultrasound or needs additional imaging evaluation. Because dense breast, they carry higher risk. They are not the only risk factor, but they do carry higher risk factors. So firstly, that is due to development of a pre-malignant lesion such as atypical duct hyperplasia, that is elevated growth environment. Secondly, a woman who is having naturally overactive aromatase, that is overproduction of the estrogen. So these are the theories which are supporting the that higher breast is able to means risk factor for a breast cancer. Does hormones affect on breast? Yes. The hormone replacement therapy which is given for the to decrease the hot flashes in the postmenopausal women, yes, it is going to increase the breast density. Again the same, this aromatase enzyme is that synthesizes estrogen. If it is severe, to counter this process, sometimes aromatase inhibitors are given to block the synthesis of estrogen. This is the most common question the patients are asking us. Every day when I do following sonogram after a dense breast, they ask, you told my breast is dense. Can I do something to modify this? The answer is no, or don't know. That is the best answer. Because still it is inconclusive what can change the breast density. But a few of the studies have told that it is genetically predisposed. It could be more than 50% is it genetically predisposed. But one thing is very important. One mammogram has shown dense breast. Later the density has decreased. But that first mammogram when it was done and it has shown a dense breast, at least it carries that 5 to 10 years that risk of breast cancer, whatever is seen in the dense breast. This question answers your question. Are there any tests better than a mammogram for dense breast? Yes, breast ultrasound and MRI. This study tells early detection of breast cancer, benefits and risks of supplemental breast ultrasound in asymptomatic women, that is a woman who came for a screening but she has a dense breast with mammographically dense breast tissue. Systematic review was done and the conclusion was supplemental breast ultrasound in the population of women with mammographically dense breast tissue, that is ACR 3 and 4, permits detection of small, otherwise occult breast cancers. Potential adverse impacts for women in this intermediate risk group are associated with an increased biopsy rate. Unnecessarily we may do a biopsy. So better next advise the next immediate investigation and get clarified is there anything or it is due to normally dense breast, or is there any underlying mass or a cyst or a fibroadenoma which is giving this appearance. Let us see on mammogram how the benign and malignant calcifications look. The diagnostic approach would be to categorize into morphology, distribution and change over time. Calcifications can be categorized into benign, intermediate, where we cannot tell whether they are really benign or malignant, and purely malignant. The first group, that is the diffuse group, it shows a similar appearing cluster of calcification throughout the breast. It's a benign one. And the second one is a regional. Though they are confined to one region, it's in a larger volume and they are not in the ductal distribution. That is very most important. It's also a benign one. And this cluster, at least 5 calcifications should be there in one region, and this is an intermediate, because sometimes when there are linear calcification, they appear to follow the ductal course, they can be intermediate or malignant. Segmental, yes, calcium deposits, they are in the course of the ducts and they are branching, they are malignant, no doubt. So benign, intermediate and malignant. So whenever we see some calcification, we have to tell whether it is diffuse or regional or clustered or segmental. Then micro or macro calcification. Micro is less than 5 mm, macro is more than 5 mm. Stability of an intermediate or suspicious microcalcification is unreliable to exclude a malignancy. This applies only, the stability applies only to a benign lesion. Yes, it is benign on follow-up. But once we see that an intermediate calcification, microcalcification, and it was stable on one, it need not be stable on successive. So that stability cannot be dependent. It mainly the morphology which matters a lot. Change over time is the one which is very important, that conflicting data concerning this, the value of absence of change over time. Yeah, even this applies to a benign one. But we think that a malignant, we have given some intermediate, we do a follow-up, it doesn't change, we think that it is benign. No. Rather than the change over time, the morphology of calcification, where you're grouping it into intermediate or malignant or a benign, is more important than the stability, and stability can only be relied on if the calcification of a probably benign form or a benign form. And here we see, to cite this example, the slide which was given on the left side shows fewer calcifications, and we had given it as probably benign. And on the right side, after 6 months follow-up, the calcifications have increased. So you cannot just rely on telling that probably benign, so your chances will be decreased. A follow-up can give answer, and more than that, morphology is very important. Skin calcifications should not be misinterpreted as microcalcifications. And this tattoo sign, as we can see, there are few calcifications in the oblique, mediolateral oblique and craniocaudal. These are not changing in shape. So they tell that it is a tattoo in the skin. So no need to worry about, these are just benign. The same calcifications which were to tell the tattoo or skin calcifications, they have the same appearance on the mediolateral oblique and the craniocaudal. Vascular calcifications, yes, they give a clue. Both the vessels are calcified, and we can see, though they are linear, both the walls are calcified. Sometimes it is misleading when only one wall of the vessel is calcified. This coarse or popcorn calcification we can see in fibroadenoma, not to be investigated further, it's a benign calcification. Sometimes, yes, they may resemble malignant type when they are not classical of a popcorn. That time it may need a biopsy. And in this, as we see, there are large rod-like calcifications. They are formed in the ectatic ducts. So when we see, it's not branching, but it's following the course of a duct. When branching, yes, it needs to be further investigated. Otherwise, it's not so, because they have a lucent center, and usually they are bilateral and they radiate towards the nipple. And sometimes the round and punctate calcifications, they are classified as barytes too when they are scattered. But 3 or 4, BIRADS 3 or 4, when their isolated cluster is seen only in the same breast where there was a cancer or a contralateral one, yes, you have to raise a suspicion and do further investigation. And these are 0.5 to 1 millimeter in size. They are formed in terminal duct. This is a rim or egg calcification which is seen in fat necrosis. No need to investigate, this is a benign calcification. And these are the images which show oblique and craniocaudal. They show the milk of calcium which changes. There is layering here, cup-like, which is seen. So these are also benign calcifications. These are the same calcifications which have not changed much over the craniocaudal and mediolateral, benign. These are dystrophic calcifications. They are macro and dystrophic, so no need to worry. Yes, let us come to the suspicious calcifications. They cannot be clearly defined. That they cannot be confined to one shape or form, and so we are grading it into BIRADS 4. Here few look like punctate calcifications, and few look like hazy, and few look like branching, and there are clusters more than 5 in one region or a segment. However, in this we cannot see the ductal course where they are following the ductal course, but yes, it is a suspicious calcification. And these amorphous calcifications, most of them are benign, but 20% have higher risk and 20% are malignant. Coarse heterogeneous calcification, here whatever we see, when we have magnified that, we can see these, and they are branching, you can see. So these coarse heterogeneous microcalcifications, they are conspicuous, very irregular calcifications, most common in ductal carcinoma. Fine pleomorphic calcification, here very much following the course of the duct, and there are multiple and more than cluster. It's not a regional one, so it's mainly following the course of the duct, so it is malignance. Here it is very typical. There is a mass with a spiculated margin and center clustered calcification, very favoring malignancy. This is a typical branching calcification, what we see in ductal carcinoma. It's extending. So you can see the branch as well as the ductal course. So it's for the malignancy. So let us come to the last part of the topic, radiation and mammography. So gynecologist asks, I'm referring the patient each and every day, how much radiation you are giving to the patient? Is it worth sending the patient, or is it worth abandoning the procedure? See, the design of equipment is such that only the part of the woman exposed, that is, only the breast tissue is irradiated and not to the other parts, first thing. For this reason, the quantitative effective dose is not used. It's the glandular dose what we are giving is calculated. There is a mean glandular dose. Typically, it is in the range of 1.5 to 3 Gary per film, that is per exposure, I am telling. We have given the range because the lesser dense take the lesser exposure, more dense they take more exposure. So it is the range which matters than only one typical value. At the dose of 2 milligare, the fatal cancer is approximately 1 in 50,000. I'm going to show a comparative study where cancer-induced, radiation-induced cancer and breast cancer from the deaths due to breast cancer. So you will know what is important, risk versus benefit. So according to NHS, the breast mammography causes cancer in 1 in 1 lakh to 1 in 10,000. This radiology article tells the risk of radiation-induced breast cancer from mammographic screening. For this mammographic screening regimens considered that beginning at the age of 40, this risk is small compared with the expected mortality reduction achievable through screening. And the risk of radiation-induced breast cancer should not be a deterrent from mammographic screening for women over the age of 40 years. So in this tables you can see the left table, this table tells an age-specific incidence of invasive breast cancer, and this is lifetime risk of radiation-induced breast cancer for single screening mammogram. Let us compare the same age. In the 35 years age, the risk of radiation-induced cancer is 11%. When you take the 35 years range, the incidence of breast carcinoma is 37%. So here the benefit is more than the risk. And when you compare the same 40 years, it is 8%. But when you go to 40 years age, it is 138%. So the risk of getting a cancer is more when compared to the radiation alone induced breast cancer. And this also tells that the radiation induced breast cancer is very less when compared to the each age. So the benefits include low dose of radiation used in screening mammography has not proved to be caused so much harmful effects, and the benefit of early diagnosis and treatment of breast cancer far outweighs the risk of the small amount of radiation which is received during a screening mammogram. Just to highlight, October is the Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Let us spread the awareness and let us solve the whatever the patients have, that radiation is there in the mammogram, and tell them what to be done, what not to be done. Thank you.
Question.
What if a lady says they got a strong family history and she's in her late 30s and she insists on a mammography, so ultrasound? What do we do?
Yes, sir. According to the recommendation, strong family history, I've already told who comes into a strong family history and moderate family history. For example, a person has a cancer in one family. For example, she has got it 40 years. So the members of that family should start screening 10 years before that. So that is by 30 years they should start. Only if there is a strong family history, proven family history, then. Otherwise, no. Breast ultrasound for the younger women less than 40 years. Only the mammogram should be started after 40.
What about macrocalcifications? That is one of the common findings which we see.
So macrocalcifications are benign, but once they occur in clustered form, like for example, a patient has breast cancer, mastectomy has been done or lumpectomy has been done, we see macrocalcification which are clustered in one region, then we cannot tell they are macrocalcification, they are more than 0.5, they are benign. No, because they are clustered, we have to investigate. For example, if the patient doesn't have any cancer, nothing, she's come for screening and we have seen the macrocalcification. When they are scattered bilaterally all over the breast, it is benign. When they are clustered in a more than 5 in one group and they appear to follow ductal course, yes, then they have to be investigated. Otherwise, most of the time, macrocalcifications, nothing to worry.
What is the youngest age in a normal population to get a breast cancer and in a patient with a family history of breast cancer?
There is no statistics for that because each family, as I told, like for example, a family member has a breast cancer at 40 years, so they are advised or recommended to start screening at 30 years. So like that, in each family, they will be having breast cancer. They would have got breast cancer at different ages. So
At
till now we have not got the
25, is it possible to have breast cancer?
very, 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 very rare.
Because we had one.
Very rare. The youngest I have seen is in the RxTS is 39 years.
39.
39 years. She had a strong family history. So invasive ductal carcinoma was the biopsy report.
Is there any study on breast implants and cancer? Breast implants. So they've got some breast implants. Do they have any tendency to get whatever tissues remaining, to get cancer?
So they should not be refused to go for a mammogram. They have to be advised for a mammogram, because for example, like in Angelina Jolie, she has got a prophylactic mastectomy done, it doesn't mean that her risk is reduced. It is reduced from maybe some higher percentage to a low percentage, but they have to be encouraged to go for the mammogram. But the dose, to tell, with implants in the mammography, the dose is higher.
Radiation dose.
Radiation dose is higher. But they have to undergo as other patients.
Suppose there is a macrocalcification, one breast not following the doctor, what do you do then?
No, we don't follow. I mean, we don't follow up. It's a benign one. Like we write discrete, they are scattered macro calcifications in both the breasts. They are very typical of benign calcifications. Here and there
But if it's only in one breast,
one breast scattered, no cluster, it's a benign one.
What is the cost of genetic screening for breast? In
Actually,
India,
when I
because
was
we never heard it in
$3,000.
India.
doing the Google search,
$3,000 for
I did
BRAC.
Google search.
In India?
Yeah, in India we multiply it.
I didn't know like where all it's available.
It's not available in India.
Now.
yet.
But in
Not
Google
a-
search when I did, it showed Manipal Hospital and
St. John's both.
St. John's
St.
and
John's.
one more hospital.
It's
they
available,
showed.
is it?
Yeah, it is available.
But some people are not available in India.
No, sir, St.
Not
John's
that
and
costly,
Manipal both are doing proctor screening.
Not that cost.
Not
3,000.
that costly,
So
I mean $3,000. It's not that costly.
Not costly.
Not that costly.
It's something around some 50,000
Yeah.
or 25,000, whatever they have cited in
Depends
the
on-
website. So one gene 12,000 or 15,000,
Yes, sir.
something
If you
like
want to do
that.
colon cancer screening, I mean family history and all, the different genes, different prices.
And the BRCA screening is not that costly also.
Ah,
BRCA
it's
screening
not
is
that
around, 8,000 in St. John's if I'm not mistaken.
But whatever I saw in the website in Manipal Hospital, it is some 12,000 to 15,000
Maybe
for
it's a
one gene.
combination. One gene maybe 12,000.
One gene.
Then
Combination is
BRCA1,
higher.
BRCA2, each of them they will chart separately. If you're writing both 1 and 2, if you know what the person whom you're referring family history, which gene it is, you can specifically say one or
Specifically
two.
for that.
But if you don't know, you'll have to ask for both, then for each they will.
Where do you ask when if there is a suspicion in mammogram or a sonomammogram? Would it biopsy? When do you say biopsy has to be done, or when do you say the repeat scan has to be done? Because it might spread very malignant. It could spread within the next screening. It might have already spread to the other organs. So what would be
Once
the
we give suspicious abnormality, we have to next recommend what is the next investigation. We cannot just do a follow-up. Biopsy has to be. Then if it biopsy, whatever the biopsy comes, based on that, we'll decide whether.
by that what 3 or 4?
Four.
4 biopsy has to be done.
Biopsy.
Any more questions? Oh.
Today my topic is about dyspepsia. I'd just like to discuss all the causes of dyspepsia. Dyspepsia is defined as derived from Greek word. It means literally difficult digestion, and it's often broadly defined as pain or discomfort centered in the abdomen, upper abdomen, and may include multiple and varying symptoms. They may present either with epigastric pain or postprandial fullness, early satiety, anorexia, belching, nausea and vomiting, upper abdominal bloating, and even heartburn and regurgitation are included in the definition of dyspepsia. There are various causes of dyspepsia. The luminal gastrointestinal causes, most of them are like gastric valvular intestinal ischemia, functional dyspepsia, GERD, neoplasms, gastric infections, gastroparesis, irritable bowel syndrome, peptic ulcer disease, parasites. So all these things are important causes of dyspepsia. Various other causes like medications. There is a long list of medications which cause dyspepsia, and all these things should be kept in mind when we are evaluating a patient with dyspepsia. Other causes like pancreatobiliary disorders, biliary pain, they may present with just dyspepsia, and cholelithiasis, choledocholitis, these things should be excluded. Chronic pancreatitis and pancreatic neoplasms may present with dyspepsia. Other causes like systemic causes like adrenal insufficiency, congestive heart failure, diabetes mellitus, hyperparathyroidism, renal insufficiency, thyroid disease, all these things predispose to dyspepsia. These are all causes of dyspepsia. And organic causes, I would like to concentrate on the organic causes of dyspepsia here today. The most common and important things what we see here, gastroesophageal reflux disease, peptic ulcer disease, gastric and esophageal cancer, pancreatic and biliary tract disorders. most important identifiable causes underlying dyspeptic symptoms are peptic ulcer disease and gastroesophageal reflux disease. Malignancies of upper GI tract and celiac disease are less common, but they are also important causes of. These should be in the differential diagnosis of dyspeptic symptoms. And the investigation of choice in all these persons with dyspeptic symptoms is endoscopy, because it will identify erosive esophagitis, peptic ulcer disease, gastric and esophageal cancer. So all these things need to be excluded before before just excluding patient of dyspepsia, just like non-ulcer dyspepsia. So these are all the identifiable causes, and endoscopy should be done in these patients. Systematic studies indicate that approximately 20% of patients with dyspeptic symptoms have erosive esophagitis, 20% have endoscopy negative GERD, 10% have peptic ulcer, and 2% have Barrett's esophagus. 1 or less than 1% may have malignancy, but even that less than 1% we should not miss without doing endoscopy. So here I would like to discuss about GERD. The gastroesophageal reflux disease is a digestive disorder that affects the lower esophageal sphincter, the ring muscle between the esophagus and the stomach. GERD occurs when the lower esophageal sphincter is weak or relaxes inappropriately and allowing the stomach contents to flow into the upper esophagus. Causes most important, hiatus hernia, which may weaken the lower esophageal sphincter and increases the risk for gastroesophageal reflux. Often vomiting, straining or sudden physical exertion can cause increased pressure in both abdomen, resulting in obesity and pregnancy contribute to this condition. Certain foods and beverages including chocolate, peppermint, these things will trigger reflux. Cigarette smoking relaxes lower esophageal sphincter and causes reflux. Obesity and pregnancy can play a role in GERD symptoms. Most important symptoms are heartburn. Most of the time patients refer to as acid indigestion. The burning, pressure or pain of heartburn can last as long as 2 hours, and it's most often worse after eating. Many people obtain relief by standing upright or by taking an antacid, and this is what most of the patients do without consulting a doctor. Most of the antacids being sold over the counter are this for the reflux symptoms most of the time. And there is a Los Angeles classification for endoscopy of esophagitis in endoscopy actually. The first picture what we are seeing. This is Los Angeles classification graded as A, B, C, D. What we are seeing here is a single mucosal break in the GE junction. It's a grade A esophagitis and it is less than 5 mm. When the break is more than 5 mm, as seen in this second picture, it's called grade B distal esophagitis. Basically, the progression indicates the severity of esophagitis. And this is grade C and this is grade D, where more than 50% of the circumference is involved with erosion. And complications of reflux disease, long-standing reflux disease causes many complications like hemorrhage, ulcer, esophageal stricture, Barrett's esophagus and carcinoma esophagus. I'll show you a picture. This is a picture of barium which is showing esophageal stricture. It's a peptic stricture, smooth borders are seen here. It's a peptic stricture. An endoscopic view of the same peptic stricture is seen here. It's a Barrett's esophagus. This is a complication of long-standing reflux again, and it's a pre-malignant condition for adenocarcinoma. This is endoscopic view of Barrett's esophagus. Here adenocarcinoma is seen in this is a adenocarcinoma at the GE junction. It's a complication of Barrett's esophagus and chronic reflux. Treatment, basically lifestyle and dietary modifications. Main aim of treatment is decreasing the amount of reflux and reducing the damage of the esophageal lining, and avoiding foods and beverages that cause LES, weakening the LES, and these foods like chocolate, peppermint, alcoholic beverages, coffee should be avoided. Decreasing the size and size of portions at mealtime may help in control symptoms. Most of the time, it's advised, even otherwise, it's advised to have small meals frequently. Eating meals at least 2 to 3 hours before bedtime may lessen the reflex by allowing the acid in the stomach to decrease and stomach to empty partially. Most of the time, these GERD patients, the symptoms will be severe in the night actually. So 2 to 3 hours before bedtime, if they have their dinner, they'll be stopping. Smoking is important to reduce GERD symptoms. And medications, antacids can help neutralize acid in the esophagus and stomach and stop heartburn. H2 blockers like cimetidine, famotidine, nizatidine and ranitidine. And most importantly, proton pump inhibitors decreases acid reflex because they completely decrease the acid secretion in the stomach. And there are other approaches of therapy that will strengthen the lower esophageal sphincter and quicken the emptying of stomach. These are motility drugs like syntapride, tablets like drugs like bethanecol and metoclopramide. They increase the lower strength of lower esophageal sphincter. Small number of people with GERD may need surgery because of severe reflex and poor response to medical treatment. And I'd like to insist here, if it's very small number of patients who may need surgery. Fundoplication is a surgical procedure of choice, and it increases the pressure of lower esophageal sphincter. Endoscopic procedures that involve placing stitches in the lower esophageal sphincter. I mean, these are newer treatment options, but they are not yet been approved by FDA. The next important thing, non-ulcer dyspepsia. This is the most common cause of dyspepsia what we see, and it's a common term used to characterize abdominal pain centered in the epigastrium. Non-ulcer dyspepsia usually affects younger adults and women, more common. And symptoms would be like chronic or recurrent abdominal pain or discomfort which is centered in the abdomen, and at least 3 months history of similar complaints is needed to diagnose. There is Rome 3 diagnostic criteria for functional dyspepsia. At least 3 months with onset of at least 6 months previously, one or more of the following. It should be postprandial fullness, early satiation, epigastric pain or epigastric burning. And there should be no evidence of any structural disease, including structural disease like in endoscopy there should not be even erosions to diagnose non-ulcer dyspepsia. And then as per, it's an ultrasound abdomen should be done to rule out any biliary tract or pancreatic disorders. When there is no evidence of structural disease and these symptoms are present for more than 3 months, diagnosed as non-ulcer dyspepsia. No specific tests of investigation. This is only diagnosis of exclusion actually. It's usually made after ruling out other disorders. Upper endoscopy is performed. Even in this condition, upper GI endoscopy is important. An ultrasound scan of upper abdomen should also be done. And more treatment is many patients respond well to stimulation and reassurance. And when patient should be given confidence that he doesn't have any underlying serious problem. And anxiety, stress, all these things should be controlled in these patients. General attention to diet. Less of fatty foods, more of fiber. Normal, whatever we suggest as a good diet, those things should be advocated. Smoke, to reduce smoking, to stop smoking and alcohol, all these things should be addressed. Treatment with medications has variable success. In a subgroup of patients with non-ulcer dyspepsia, there is something called delayed gastric emptying, which can be documented actually. There was a study actually which has shown that in patients with postprandial fullness, in those 4 groups, 4 symptoms, the patients with postprandial symptoms, in more than 70 to 75% there will be delayed gastric emptying. So in patients with non-ulcer dyspepsia, some prokinetic like as we discussed in GERD, metoclopramide or syntapride, it helps in these patients. last and most important, peptic ulcer disease. Peptic ulcers are open sores in the lining of stomach, esophagus or duodenum. Most important cause again is Helicobacter pylori. Other causes are non-steroidal NSAIDs. Long-term use of these NSAIDs causes peptic ulcer. These drugs block prostaglandins, which causes, which maintains the blood flow and protects the area from injury. Other causes of ulcers are conditions that can result in direct damage to the stomach wall, such as heavy alcohol, radiation therapy, burns, or any other physical injury. Risk factors of peptic ulcer disease, again hereditary. It's older age, chronic pain of any cause like arthritis, fibromyalgia, because these patients are prone to take NSAID, alcohol abuse. Diabetes may increase the risk of having H. pylori. Lifestyle factors including chronic stress, coffee drinking, all these things increase the chance of peptic ulcer disease, and cigarette smoke. Signs and symptoms, most importantly, abdominal pain with burning or gnawing sensation, pain 2 to 3 hours after eating, and pain is often worse by an empty stomach. Nighttime pain is very common in peptic ulcer disease. Heartburn, indigestion, belching, nausea, vomiting, poor appetite and weight loss. All these things are symptoms of peptic ulcer disease. And again, complications of peptic ulcer disease, as we all know, hemorrhage, penetration or perforation, and obstruction because of, it may be gastric outlet obstruction caused by a gastric ulcer in the pylorus, or a duodenal ulcer causing gastric outlet obstruction. All these things are complications. Diagnosis, upper gastrointestinal series, barium X-rays to check for an ulcer, but with an endoscopy available, now it's not being done to diagnose a peptic ulcer disease. Endoscopy has an important role in diagnosing the disease and treatment of complications. Other tests we can take a biopsy for H. pylori also with an endoscopy. There are other non-invasive methods for diagnosing H. pylori like urease breath test and all. It's least invasive, is at least 95% accurate. Treatment is again most important. Lifestyle starts with lifestyle modification. Diet rich in fiber is more important. Quit smoking, decrease alcohol intake, cut down on coffee, reduce stress, and all those things help. Medications, most importantly, whenever there is a peptic ulcer disease, either gastric ulcer or duodenal ulcer, the first thing is to confirm H. pylori infection. That's by biopsy we can do it. And triple therapy to eradicate H. pylori is most important thing, because most important cause for peptic ulcer disease is H. pylori. Triple therapy, which includes proton pump inhibitors and 2 antibiotics, is commonly used, and success rate would be around 90 to 95% in treating. Even in that 5 to 7% of patients, they may have resistance to different antibiotics. So these patients may need a second dose of triple therapy with a different antibiotic. It's rare actually. Even the resistance to antibiotics varies from area to area. If you take in Chennai, there was resistance to metronidazole, but in Bangalore we don't have any specific antibiotic which has shown resistance to H. pylori treatment.
It's 10 days or 14 days?
It's 14 days. At least in India we have to give for 14 days. There is a chance of recurrence with 7 days and 10-day therapy. So it should be advocated for 14 days.
After that, how long they have to wait for the reconfirm?
So actually, sir, we give a treatment for 14 days, and we continue a PPI, any PPI for 6 weeks. And the patient should be, if it is a gastric ulcer, there should be a repeat endoscopy done, because gastric ulcers tend to become malignant. If it's a duodenal ulcer, only if the patient has symptoms will repeat an endoscopy. But if it's a gastric ulcer, after 8 weeks, we have to do a repeat endoscopy to see that the ulcer has healed completely. If the ulcer is still there, biopsy should be taken to rule out malignancy. It's a must if it is a gastric ulcer. With duodenal ulcer, 99% of the time it is benign. It's a peptic ulcer definitely. But gastric ulcer tend to become malignant. So we have to do a repeat endoscopy after 8 weeks actually. So and symptomatic treatment with antacids can be administered. H2 blockers and proton pump inhibitors plays an important role in treatment.
Which is superior, sir, H2 receptor blocker or PPS?
Now, PPI is definitely more effective than H2 receptor, unless a patient has some patients. Now, at least in this era, only patients who are not tolerating PPI will be suggested H2 receptor blocker. I'd like to show you an nail gastroscope. So we are going to get a gastroscope here. So I think I have emphasized the importance of endoscopy in treating all these cases.
So within 15 days, endoscope will be here?
Yeah. So basically, what are the other uses in the endoscopy I would like to emphasize here. If bleeding from an ulcer does not stop by using medications and supportive care, then endoscopic therapy can be done. This is an picture of endoscopic picture of a peptic ulcer with an active ooze and spurting. We can manage this, control this bleeding with endoscopic techniques. This is a peptic ulcer with a visible vessel and adjacent clot. Even this thing should be managed endoscopically. We should remove the clot, and if there is any ooze, some injection therapy, all those things should be done. This is a peptic ulcer with adherent clot. It's a duodenal ulcer with a black spot actually. These ulcers doesn't need any endoscopic treatment. They will heal with the PPI infusion. It's a gastric ulcer with a hematoma spot again. This doesn't need any endoscopic management, but these deep ulcers, we should be more suspicious about a malignancy. So once the patient is fine after 8 weeks, we should repeat an endoscopy to take a biopsy if the ulcer is not healed. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
Questions?
This H. pylori, a lot of people don't do endoscopy. Then this breath test alone is good enough?
Yes, sir.
Or
Breath
blood
test
test?
is good enough, sir. It's 95% accurate. That's why.
Breath test or blood test?
Actually, breath test, blood test, even antigen test is also positive. Is also effective, but rather than antigen test, breath test is non-invasive. Breath test is more 95% accurate. If it is antigen, stool antigen, it is around 85 to 87%.
Which two antibiotics you suggest? Amoxicillin?
Amoxicillin and
Clarithromycin, not metronidazole.
Metronidazole is basically in some parts of India we have seen metronidazole, which is resistance to metronidazole. So now we are just avoiding metronidazole.
What if they are allergic to amoxicillin? Then what do you do?
Sir, if they are allergic to amoxicillin, we can give metronidazole and clarithromycin. If they are allergic to, some people are allergic to amoxicillin and clarithromycin, amoxicillin and metronidazole. So only option left is clarithromycin there. In those patients, we can add levofloxacin.
Levofloxacin at 500.
Levofloxacin at 500 mg twice daily.
Twice daily.
Twice daily. It's very rare, but we come across some patients who are allergic to amoxicillin and metronidazole.
Now with this advent of proton pump inhibitors, does it in any way cause Clostridium difficile infections?
Actually, there are studies which have shown that increased proton pump inhibitors, but it's only in few groups of patients. More hospitalized patients, older age, there are risks for Clostridium difficile when it is associated with proton pump inhibitors. It's seen, there are studies which have shown that older age people, prolonged hospitalization with prolonged PPI injections or orally has increased Clostridium difficile.
So then how do you manage those?
But not in outpatient definitely.
Not in outpatient.
Not in outpatient definitely. It's only in older age and prolonged hospitalization patients. They have not documented any Clostridium difficile infection in outpatients. Normally who are taking orally. Because in those patients, they have some other comorbidity which is causing. But definitely in those patients, it was there was shown that the association is with proton pump inhibitors.
Any side effects of prolonged use of PPIs?
Sir, I again coming to that, the prolonged use again it differs. There is a study which has been done. Who has in more than 1,100 people. They have followed them who have been taking proton pump inhibitors for 11 years, and only side effect what they have observed in those patients was they had decreased bone density.
Vitamin B12 deficiency?
Vitamin B12 deficiency is theoretically right, sir, but it's not proven.
Does it prolonged use decrease the immunity of the stomach to fight the normal organisms?
That's what, sir. That's again small intestinal bacterial growth,
Oh.
Clostridium difficile infection.
Oh.
It's there, but not in outpatient at least. But definitely, prolonged proton pump inhibitor has its own side effects. Definitely, it has its own side effects.
So safely they can use for 10 weeks.
Yeah. 10 weeks. That's okay, sir. 6 months is okay, but where we see patients who have been using for 5 years, 6 years also, then definitely it's not advisable actually. Most of them who have been using for 5 years, 6 years, most of them will have non-ulcer dyspepsia.
How good is Gaviscon?
I wanted to tell again.
Yeah, you should tell.
Gaviscon is very effective in controlling symptoms of acid reflux, and most of our PPI, whatever we give before meals and all, this is like it helps postprandially. It's very effective postprandially. Nighttime symptoms, postprandial symptoms, whoever have this severe reflux after the meal, Gaviscon, it forms a layer actually. Will you have any demonstration? It forms a layer over the food contents, whatever food we have, and it protects the reflex. It doesn't allow the acid to go in. It's very effective postprandial.
So once the endoscope is come, please all of you kindly refer to doctor so that we can get some good diagnosis.
They have more and more.
Another very important phenomena that WHO has communicated called gas ka gola of this Punjab and Pakistan. A very important documentary has been made related to upper GI endoscopy and all that thing. Upper GI symptomatology, in that large number of people in that area come with that upper GI symptom. It is called gas ka gola syndrome. In fact, the WHO documentary on that. Our Nimhans fellow, ex-fellow is also involved in that particular thing. And it is a documentary made.
Thank you.
Thank you.